Back in 2014, I was working at a small firm that had been struggling for months. The writing was on the wall when they started cutting hours and delaying paychecks. I should have seen it coming, but I was young and naive, thinking things would turn around. When they finally called everyone into the conference room that Tuesday morning to announce they were closing down immediately, I felt like the rug had been pulled out from under me. I had been living paycheck to paycheck like most people my age, with maybe $300 in savings on a good month. My rent was due in 2 weeks, along with my car payment, insurance, and credit card minimum. I did the math in my head and realized I was completely screwed. The unemployment office told me it would take at least 3 weeks to process my claim, and even then, the payments wouldn't cover all my bills. I called my father and swallowed my pride. We had a decent relationship, but I hated asking for money. I explained the whole situation and asked if I could borrow $1,200 to get me through the next month while I job hunted. He didn't even hesitate and told me he'd transfer it to my account that same day. He said I could just pay him back whenever I found work again. The money showed up the next day, and I was able to pay my bills and buy groceries. I spent the following weeks applying everywhere and finally landed a decent job at a tech startup. The pay was actually better than my old job, and I was relieved to be back on track. When I got my first paycheck, I went online to pay my father back. My bank had this bill pay feature that I'd never used before, but it seemed straightforward enough. I entered his name, address, and the amount, then hit send. I texted him right away to let him know the check was coming. A week passed and my father called asking if I was sure I'd sent the payment because he hadn't received it yet. I told him I'd used the bank's online bill pay system and maybe it just took longer than expected since I'd never used it before. I asked him to give it a few more days, but several more days went by with nothing. I called the bank, and they let me stop payment on the original check for free. I just wrote a personal check and mailed it the old-fashioned way. My father got it within 3 days, and I figured that was the end of it. I assumed their online system had just glitched, somehow. 2 months later, I was sorting through my mail when I found an envelope from some medical facility I'd never heard of. Inside was a check for exactly $1,200. I stared at it, completely confused. I called the number on the letterhead and explained that I'd received a check from them but had never been a patient there. I thought there might be some mistake. The woman on the phone looked it up and told me it wasn't a mistake. She said it was an overpayment refund on my father's account, and that the check was legitimate and mine to keep. When I asked why they would send it to me instead of him, she explained that my address was what they had on file for refunds on that account. She mentioned that our call was being recorded, which seemed standard for their office. I was still confused, so I called my father and asked if he'd had any recent medical bills with this place. He'd never heard of them and hadn't been to any new doctors in years. I told him they'd sent me a refund check for $1,200 with his name on the account, but he had no idea what it was about. I looked up the medical facility online and saw their address. That's when it hit me. My father lived on Saddlewood Drive, but when I typed his address into the bill pay system, my phone had autocorrected it to Sandalwood Drive. Same house number, different street name. The check I'd sent to pay him back had somehow ended up at this medical facility, and they'd applied it to his account by name. I called the medical facility back to explain the mix-up. I told them I thought I knew what had happened, and tried to explain that I'd accidentally sent a payment to their facility that was meant for someone else, and they'd applied it to an account with the same name. Karen, the same woman from before, got extremely rude with me. She said she'd already told me everything I needed to know and didn't know why I was calling again. She insisted they'd sent me what they owed me, that the account was settled, and that she wouldn't discuss it anymore. When I tried to explain that the original payment was a mistake, she cut me off. I asked if she was absolutely sure this money belonged to me. She practically shouted that yes, the money was mine, and told me to stop calling them about it. Then she hung up on me. I sat there for a moment, then started laughing. If they were so insistent that the money was legally mine, who was I to argue? I drove to my bank and deposited the check that afternoon. 6 weeks later, my phone rang with a number I recognized. A different woman from the medical center called to tell me there had been a mistake with the refund they'd sent me. She said I needed to return $1,200 that had been sent to me in error. I told her she was wrong and that she should go back and listen to the recorded calls I'd made to their office. I gave her the exact dates and explained that I'd called multiple times about the check, and Karen had told me repeatedly that the money was mine to keep. I mentioned that Karen had been very rude about it and had told me to stop calling. The new woman said that was incorrect information, but I interrupted her. I explained that everything had been recorded and that their office had confirmed multiple times that I was entitled to that money and that the account was settled. I told her Karen had specifically told me to stop calling about it because it was settled. When she said they needed the money back, I told her to take it up with whoever had given me the wrong information. I made it clear that I wasn't responsible for their office's mistakes and hung up. I never heard from them again. Not only did I get to keep the $1,200 that was rightfully mine according to their own recorded statements, but it was exactly the same amount I had originally tried to send my father. In a weird way, the universe had corrected their mistake and given me back what I'd accidentally given them. My father got his money back through my personal check, and I got to keep what they insisted was an overpayment refund. I joined the Navy straight out of high school because I wanted structure in my life and to serve my country. My dad was a Marine, and hearing his stories made me want to follow a similar path. After boot camp and my training, I got assigned to a ship based on the West Coast. Part of my duties included standing guard at the entrance to the piers where our ships were docked. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it was important for security. Most nights were pretty routine, checking IDs, letting authorized personnel through, dealing with the occasional pizza delivery guy, trying to find a sailor who ordered food. This particular Saturday evening started like any other. I was at my post with another guard, and for the first few hours everything was going smoothly. A few delivery drivers showed up, some sailors came back from shore leave looking like they'd had a good time, typical stuff for a weekend evening. Then this woman approached the gate and everything went sideways. Fast. She walked up to me with this attitude like she owned the place. I did what I always do and asked to see her identification. She let out this huge dramatic sigh and pulled out her driver's license, telling me that her son was on the ship. I asked her if he was coming to get her, and she seemed confused about why that would matter. I explained that I couldn't let her onto the pier without proper identification or an escort. She pointed to her license like that solved everything, so I had to clarify that she would need either a military ID or a temporary pass to enter alone. Since she didn't have those, her son would need to come down from the ship to escort her on board. While I was explaining this to her, another person walked up with her military ID already in hand. I started to process her through since she had proper authorization. That's when this woman completely lost it. She yelled that she was there first and called the other woman a nasty name that would make most people's ears burn. I told her that kind of language was uncalled for, but she just got more aggressive. She asked what I was going to do about it and called me a slur that referenced German soldiers from World War II. I felt my blood pressure spike, but I kept my cool. Part of my training was learning to de-escalate situations, and I knew losing my temper would only make things worse. I ordered her to step away from the gate. She refused and said she was going to see her son no matter what. Then she did something that crossed a major line. She tried to push past me. In a military installation, that's not just rude behavior anymore. That's a security breach. I pulled my oleoresin capsicum spray off my belt and positioned myself directly in front of her. For anyone who doesn't know, oleoresin capsicum spray is like pepper spray's much nastier cousin. It's designed to stop people in their tracks, and it hurts like nothing else. I gave her one final warning, telling her to step away from the gate or she would be sprayed. She looked me dead in the eye and took another step forward. Then she told me to screw myself using that same racial slur from before. That was it. I deployed the spray directly into her face, tossed the empty canister aside, and tackled her to the ground. I got the flex cuffs on her, while she screamed every curse word I'd ever heard, and several I hadn't. She was threatening to sue me, claiming she knew my commanding officer, saying she'd get the president to fire me personally. The other guard had already called for backup, and the woman I'd been trying to help had called the base police. Within minutes, we had 2 squad cars, the county sheriff's vehicle, an ambulance, and my watch supervisor all on scene. The medics started treating her for the oleoresin capsicum exposure. When they cut off the flex cuffs so they could work on her better, she immediately punched two of them and wiped the chemical residue from her face onto the third medic. The base police officer rushed over and put real metal handcuffs on her this time. I gave my statement to the sheriff and my supervisor, explaining exactly what had happened from start to finish. The other guard and the woman who'd witnessed everything gave their accounts too, which matched mine perfectly. When all was said and done, she was arrested for trespassing on government property twice, failure to follow military police instructions, resisting arrest, and assaulting 3 emergency medical technicians. Her son's ship didn't even pull into port until 2 days later. She'd shown up early and caused all this chaos for absolutely nothing. Some people might think I used too much force with the spray, but I had 5 options available to me that night. Verbal commands work on most reasonable people, but they clearly weren't working on her. Physical takedown techniques are risky when you're wearing 25 pounds of gear and carrying a sidearm. The expandable steel baton could have broken bones or worse. My 9mm pistol was never even a consideration since my life wasn't in danger. The oleoresin capsicum spray was the safest and most effective option for everyone involved. The whole thing could have been avoided if she'd just been willing to call her son or wait for him to come get her, like every other family member who visits. Instead, she chose to be entitled, racist, and violent. She learned the hard way that military installations aren't places where you can throw tantrums and expect to get your way. Her son probably had some very uncomfortable conversations with his chain of command about his mother's behavior. I almost felt bad for him, but then I remembered how she treated the medics who were trying to help her, and that sympathy disappeared pretty quickly. I'm 47 and my husband is 65. We've been married for 10 years now. I know what you're thinking about the age gap, but our relationship wasn't like that. When I met him, I was done with dating altogether. I've been cheated on so many times by guys my own age that I was completely jaded about men. I was working as an emergency call handler, taking those awful calls where people were having the worst days of their lives. The job paid minimum wage and was destroying my mental health. Then I met my husband at a coffee shop. He was reading the same book I had tucked under my arm, and we started talking about it. He was thoughtful, kind, and genuinely interested in what I had to say. We shared the same views on politics and life in general. I didn't even know he had money until 6 months into our relationship. By then, I was already falling for him because of who he was as a person. When we got married, he encouraged me to leave my stressful job. He said he could see how much it was affecting me and that I should find something I actually enjoyed doing. I meant to look for other work, but honestly, I got comfortable being at home. I could pursue hobbies, redecorate our house, and live at my own pace for the first time in years. It was such a relief after grinding away at jobs that barely paid the bills. The house became my project. It had belonged to his late wife originally, inherited from her parents, but I didn't really think about the legal details back then. I just knew it was our home now. I spent years making it beautiful, choosing new paint colors, updating the furniture, creating spaces that reflected both of our personalities. I grew attached to every room, every corner I carefully decorated. Last week, my husband had his retirement party. It was a lovely evening with his colleagues and friends. The next morning, we were having coffee, and somehow the conversation turned to wills and inheritance planning. I was expecting a normal discussion about making sure everything was in order. Then he dropped the bombshell. He told me casually that he'd been meaning to mention his will and that the house would be going to his daughter when he passed away. I nearly choked on my coffee. I stared at him, waiting for him to say he was joking. I asked him what he meant about the house going to his daughter. He explained that it had been her mother's house originally, inherited from her grandparents, and that he couldn't possibly leave it to anyone else. I pointed out that this was our home, that I'd lived here for 10 years and put so much work into making it ours. He reminded me that I knew it had belonged to his late wife, and that he'd inherited it when she died because she never got around to making a will. But morally, it should go to their daughter. The reality hit me hard. I'm 18 years younger than my husband, which means I'll probably outlive him by decades. I'm a housewife with no recent work experience. I told him that after he died, I'd be kicked out of our home and left homeless. He tried to reassure me by saying I wouldn't be homeless, that I'd get his life insurance money and half of whatever savings were left, with his daughter getting the other half. I argued back that the money wouldn't be enough to live on for the rest of my life, especially with all the expensive cruises and holidays he was planning for retirement. He suggested casually that maybe I should consider going back to work. The casual way he said it, like my entire future security was just an afterthought to him. I exploded and asked if he was kidding me. I told him I'd given up my career for him, that I'd been out of work for over 10 years because he had encouraged me to stay home. I said I put everything into this house and our marriage, and now he was just going to screw me over. He replied coldly that he'd never asked me to become a housewife, that it had been completely my choice, and that I knew the risks. I shot back that I'd never known I wouldn't inherit our home and that it was too late for me to start over in my career. I called him a complete jerk for leaving me stranded like this. Then he said something that really cut deep. He told me I'd never made any real financial contribution anyway, that we hired cleaners and housekeepers for most of the actual work, and that if anything, I'd been spending his money all these years. He was actually laughing at me while he said it, like my contribution to our marriage was some kind of joke. I screamed at him that he was being completely cruel to me, that this wasn't what I'd signed up for when I married him, and that he was a sexist pig for not recognizing what I'd given up for this family. He laughed and asked what family, pointing out it was just him and me, and that I'd chosen this lifestyle with nobody forcing me. I was so angry and hurt that I started crying. I yelled at him that he was heartless and locked myself in the guest room. I stayed there for hours trying to process what had just happened. The worst part is that I really loved him. I didn't marry him for money. I didn't even know he was wealthy when we first met. I fell for his kindness and loyalty, for how well we understood each other. But sitting in that guest room, I realized that maybe I didn't know him as well as I thought. After a few days of barely speaking to each other, I decided to do some research. I looked up my rights as a spouse and found out that in some places I might actually have legal claims to the house regardless of his will. I also started looking into divorce laws and what I'd be entitled to if our marriage ended. When I brought this up to him, his whole attitude changed. I told him I'd been doing some reading about spousal rights and inheritance laws. He asked in a sarcastic tone if I had been researching. I explained that I discovered that in some cases a surviving spouse has legal claims to the marital home regardless of whose name was originally on the deed. He asked if I was threatening to contest his will. I told him I was just saying that maybe he should reconsider his decision, that it wasn't fair to leave me with nothing after 10 years of marriage. He got really nasty. He said that if that's how I wanted to play it, maybe we should talk about divorce instead and see how much I'd get then after he'd been supporting me for 10 years. I replied that maybe we should, that at least then I'd get half of everything instead of just whatever scraps he decided to leave me. The conversation spiraled from there. He accused me of being a gold digger who was finally showing my true colors. I told him he was a manipulative old man who had tricked me into financial dependence just so he could control me. His daughter got involved. She called me up directly to have what she called a conversation. She said she'd heard I was planning to fight her father's will. I explained that I was just trying to protect my future and that I didn't think it was unreasonable to expect some security after 10 years of marriage. She told me that the house had been in their family for generations, that her mother had grown up there, and that it wasn't right for me to take it away from her. I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to take anything away from her, but that I needed somewhere to live too. She suggested I could buy my own house with the life insurance money. I pointed out that the money wouldn't last forever, and that I was going to need a place to live for potentially 30 or 40 more years. She told me coldly to get a job like everyone else. The way she said it was so dismissive, like I was some kind of parasite for having been a housewife. It reminded me exactly of how her father had spoken to me. But here's where things took an interesting turn. I decided to actually consult with a lawyer just to understand my options. What I found out was better than I'd hoped. Apparently, the house had been significantly improved and increased in value during our marriage, partly through my efforts and partly through my husband's income during our marriage years. The lawyer explained that I might have a legitimate claim to at least partial ownership of the increased value. More importantly, she told me about something called spousal support or maintenance that I might be entitled to, especially given the length of our marriage and the fact that I'd left work at his encouragement. When I shared this information with my husband, he was furious. He demanded to know if I'd actually gone to a lawyer behind his back. I told him I'd gone to understand my rights, something I should have done years ago. He said it was ridiculous and that I was trying to steal from his daughter. I replied that I was trying to protect myself from being left destitute by my own husband. But the lawyer had given me leverage I didn't have before. She'd also mentioned that if we divorced now, I'd likely be entitled to half of all marital assets, including the increased value of the house. My husband finally asked what I wanted from him. I told him I wanted him to add a clause to his will that ensured I could live in the house for the rest of my life, with ownership transferring to his daughter only after I died. Or I wanted him to provide enough money for me to buy my own home outright. He said that wasn't reasonable. I responded that what wasn't reasonable was expecting me to be homeless after spending my best years taking care of him and our home. After several more arguments and another consultation with his own lawyer, my husband finally came around to a compromise. The will now says that I have the right to live in the house until I die or choose to leave, but the daughter will inherit full ownership. Additionally, he's purchasing a larger life insurance policy to ensure I have enough money to maintain the house and support myself. His daughter wasn't happy about the arrangement, but the lawyers explained that it was actually quite generous to her, since she'd still inherit the property eventually. The whole experience opened my eyes to how vulnerable I've made myself over the years. I've since started looking for part-time work, not because I have to, but because I want to rebuild some financial independence. I never want to be in a position again where someone can threaten my basic security over an argument. My husband and I are still together, but things are different now. I love him, but I also understand that I need to look out for myself. The conversation about inheritance showed me a side of him I'd never seen before, and it wasn't pretty. I still think I was reasonable in asking for security in my old age. Being a housewife is work, even if it doesn't come with a paycheck. I gave up my career and my independence for our marriage, and I think that deserves to be recognized and protected.